I'm going to read selected poems from Children of Air India, unauthorized exhibits, and interjections. Can everyone hear me all right? Introduction. This is a work of the imagination. This is a work of fiction, weaving fact in with the fiction, merging subject voice with object voice, the eye of the author submerged into a poet persona, N for niece, N for narrator. Anne loses her aunt and uncle in the bombing of an airplane, Air India Flight 182. This is a sequence of elegies. This is an essay of fragments, a child's battered shoe, a widow's lament. This is a lament for children, dead and dead again in representations released. This is a series of transgressions, to name other people's dead, to imagine them. This is a dirge for the world. This is a tall tale. This is a saga for a nation. This is about lies. This is about truth. Another version of this introduction exists. It has been redacted. From the archive, The Weight. Everything was normal. Oceans and recovery, intense speculation, partial inflation. 39.8%. Emotional effects, extent and severity, plastic sheeting, a chain of command, an orderly fashion. 132. Everything was normal. Passengers and airlines, lines and comparison, volumes and discovery, cascading failure, attached to limb, unidentified noise, numerous agencies, corrections, pending and requests, identified changes in lieu of documents, resource insufficiency, protracted and complex, necessary discussions, inadequate security, 82 children under the age of 13. No basis for a claim, and initially cardboard, forensic and fallible. A mother and her children, by sex and by age, a nation and its peoples. Everything was normal. C, A, N, A, D, A. In the aftertime always, there is also the before. June 23rd, 1985. Punctured, probed, embedded sediments. Other people's stories. Cracks within cracks. Tales, anecdotes, gossip, family legends, tied, knots, twist, nation. A body of provinces down by the river. Each story bit a laceration, deep down secrets dismembered, one limb after another. Incident as saga, saga as tragedy, tragedy as occurrence. So what? A plane explodes. So what? People die. They die every day. Blast and counterblast. Air India Flight 182. The story of the dead, the story of other people. Do they interact? A toxin? Alloy, mixed suffering. Name the Ukraine. Find the Doukhobors. Ferret out head taxes. Also Cambodia, Ireland, the bombing of Britain, Guernica, Dresden, Gaza, Afghanistan, Khmer, Ararat. All such entries and any such list incomplete. Auschwitz. Each name releases vibrations. Komagatamoru. Internment and confiscation. Words tremble into this cornered saga, a litter suppressing action and accumulation. And there we are, down at the river, lumber on the docks, metals underground, salmon on the pier. How the date such flies buzz, 1985, to 1888, 1910, 1945, 1947, 1967, 1985, again and again. Also add 1907, 1911, 1914, 1962, 1997 and after. Scandal and song, rise up. Air India, a portal. The river, a conduit. Each story, a stain on a shack. Lean-to, split-level house, hall, lodge, grocery mart, train station, bridge, railroad, condo towers, sky train tracks, emanating messages, hoarded in a hoax nation, a taking and a taking this country, receiver of peoples, and always underneath the everlasting story. This is how we suffered. List each band, tribe, linguistic group, hereditary chief. No accounting with those names. Not released to us because we are not student enough, not seekers enough, not listeners enough. Each tale incoming, woven, unending saga. Citizens, settlers, First Nations, neighbors, families, loners, saints, thieves, liars, and fine, upstanding sons, daughters as receptacles, holding, C-A-N-A-D-A. Once we sang. Exhibit where visitations occur. The kick of my leg, the kick of my leg, the edge of my hands, the edge of my blade. Soccer and hockey, I was that kind of Canadian boy. Ask father about practice. Drive with him to the arena, sit with him inside, air cold enough to lock down memory. Ask father to walk with you to the edge park where I played. Father will tell you how smart I am. Math, sciences, French, English. Language scrapes against my edge. Indian, Canadian, English, French, melt, icicle dialects. These fragments butt, skull to grass. Follow father home. Is my room still as it was? The year of my death, the year of my death. Kick down the doors and scrape edge of a basement floor. List every item in my bedroom. Look for my hockey posters. Bodies gyrate, rock stars jump, knees bend, laminated cardboard. Insert their names here. Oh, they are redacted. Ask father to play Sony for you. It's 1985. There's my Walkman, my electronic inventions. Ask father to stop roaming the rooms of our home. If you cannot find him, he will have joined me. Ask us about joining. N speaks to a reporter, story, saga, testimony, lies, cell phone judge, children dismissed. N speaks to a reporter, I used to believe, the reporter says. N speaks, I used to believe, the reporter says, that one day there'd be more criminal charges. I used to believe, the reporter says. But now I see, after this inquiry, that'll be the end. I'm sorry. That'll be the end. N speaks to a reporter. You going to Ireland this year? You going to Ireland this year? You going to Ireland this year? N speaks to a reporter. Story, sorry, saga. What's it like to be part of the Air India story? June 23rd, 1985, evening at Sheep's Head. Fire, there is water, ocean, your name of names. Two daughters inside your topography, far-reaching Lophelia interconnect us, Eunice Norvegicus. Today we are made children of the cold water deep. Sing Sat Shri Akal, sing Om Shanti. Fibrous will be the years, their tentacles tenebrous. How many pieces of flesh? Count. 82 under the age of 13. Before breath and after. What lies underneath? one unending song. June 23rd, 1985. Memory is a biocompound. God is everywhere. There's no God. There is only history. There is no history. To our names add each epoch and song. Forgetting, released. Memory, which is a child. No child, which is a hand. Give us your hand. This much grief, preposterous. Or as the poet once said, ridiculous, the waste, sad time. We waltz with terror, phosphorus longing, the decades to come. June 23, 1985, June Dei Onisha Puchasi. In fragments at us, in movement at us, God is everywhere, nowhere, there's only time. Nestled cold and coral into its own reef, give us your wrist to bathe in this chill wind. See the hairs rise. Water is nothing but itself. Where are our names? They are redacted. Come Shiva, come Parvati, sing Radha. Add to us laments from the Upanishads, temple air, Satsang Hall, fanned and brushed. Oh, Guru Nanak, add the Bible, the Quran, Leviticus, and Deuteronomy, the Torah, the Book of Ruth, alone amid the alien corn, add us to the Wailing Wall, Jerusalem, Jerusalem. Ocean as container, come and sing with us. Add us to your memory, cheek to cheek, we dance, dance with us. Life kisses death. In water there is fire, uplifting this tune, heard by no one. And the last poem I'll read. Testimony. Her name was redacted. She was 7 years old. Her mother said she was full of life. Her mother said she was very pretty. Her mother said she loved to dance. Her mother said she loved music. Her name was redacted. She was 7 years old.
I'm going to begin the conversation. I'll start with you, Renée, first. How did you come to write Children of Air India, unauthorized exhibits and interjections? Of course, you have a family story, of course, that ties in as well. I wonder if you can share a little bit just to begin.
Can everyone hear me okay? Nice. How did I come to write it? Well, as I was saying in some pre-event discussions, I really didn't want to. After reading these poems, my heart goes out to all of you. Thank you for listening, and for me, I mean, they're just devastating. I can't believe I wrote them, to tell you the truth, Anne. I can't believe I did it. And I have to say, I lost my mom this past year, and I know many people have many griefs they hold, especially in these complex times. I find them even harder to read now than I have ever found. And I really didn't want to write them. I was in the writer's studio here at SMU, yay, life-changing, and I was writing, a fairly pedestrian chronology, kind of immigrant arrival story, sort of memoir, sort of story of how this immigrant settler, although 10 years ago I didn't really even understand the word settler, and I was writing a chronology, right? I was born in Pune, India, came to Canada as a little girl, traveled across the country with my parents, and we eventually fetched up in New Westminster. And I was writing that story. It's kind of interesting. We've lived in provinces all across Canada. My dad was a Lakshmi Brahmin Hindu from Bombay. My mom was a Sunni Muslim Patel from Gujarat. They got married. That didn't go down so well with the family. They come to Canada. My dad has a religious convergence experience in northern Quebec with the Cree Nation, becomes a United Church minister. It's pretty weird. I was always kind of embarrassed about it, and it's so complex to explain in the name, Renée Sarojini Saklikar. And so I was writing about all that, and whenever I would get to what you just heard, of course I would just shut down completely. And I just couldn't write anything. Like I just stopped writing. And my mentor at the time, Wade Compton, like a fabulous author, just said, well, you've hit the rupture and you've got to find a way in, maybe through language. And so sometimes it just takes like a little, through language. And I'm trained as a lawyer, and as you can maybe hear, I found a way in to tell the story through the archive, through the thousands of documents of reportage, the sort of language of reporting these events, and the legalistic language. And I've just read you a selection. I mean, it's a book-length series of poems that are all interconnected, published by BC's own Nightwood Editions. I'm very, very grateful to the publisher, who was here 10 years ago and is here again. Thank you, Silas. It's sort of been a momentous undertaking we set upon, and really difficult. But the way I got started was like I didn't want to get started. But the desire to write, so I think there's some writers in the audience. They're all on stage here with me. I know Dr. Amjal, very humble, also a writer. Don't you find, all of you, that the very thing you want sometimes most to do in writing you can't do? And I wanted to be a published writer. I was leaving my law practice. And I realized if I don't write this, I'm not going to write. So I started writing it. And then once I started writing it, these voices of the dead, it sounds so weird, but they just came and claimed me. And that's where I was.
Angela, I'm going to ask you, in your own research and looking at public memory, you've been in conversation with Renée for a long time. I'm wondering if you could just share a little bit about where your research has taken you into these questions and around some of the particular events around the Air India bombing itself.
Yeah, sure. Well, first I just want to say it's such a pleasure to be here. This is a celebration of the 10th anniversary of Renée's book. So momentous. I appreciate being here very much. It's an honor. Yes, well, I currently teach at the University of Winnipeg, where I also hold the Canada Research Chair in the area of culture and public memory. And the work that I do there generally is focused on monuments, memorials, and museums. That's how I describe it often to people. But I now have a long-term research project focused on public memory and the 1985 Air India bombings. And I really arrived at this topic kind of sideways, I like to say. When I was a graduate student in Toronto at York University, I was doing research on quite a different topic, nearing the end of my PhD. So this is having garnered several degrees from universities in Canada. Nearing the end of my PhD, a film was shared with me by a colleague, by the filmmaker's name is Isha Marjara. She's a Montreal-based artist, a filmmaker, photographer, multimedia artist. And her film, Desperately Seeking Helen, is a documentary drama, kind of hybrid film. It tells the story of her loss of her mother and sister in the Air India bombings in a really quite incredible way. I was really blown away by this film. It's such a creative engagement with this history. And when I began to try to understand the context of the film and the Air India bombings, I just realized, I had done several degrees at post-secondary education institutions in Canada, and I had really not heard about the Air India bombings until then. So I began to try to do research, and I found that there was almost no academic literature at all. I turned to the news media archive, so there's been a fair amount of news media coverage. There have been journalistic books published that have focused largely, I would say, on the criminal investigation. There are reams of legal documentation and some legal journals and journals of forensics that have written about the Air India bombings. But there's almost no scholarship from a sociological perspective or scholarship that thinks about the political and cultural implications of the Air India bombings in the Canadian context and beyond. Now, this was also happening around the time of the acquittal of the 2 suspects. Shortly thereafter, there was a public inquiry that was launched, and the announcement of a number of government-sponsored efforts to build memorials and other kinds of forms of redress, a bit of a scramble, I would say, to kind of respond to the lack of justice that in that moment. And so all of a sudden, there was this flurry of public attention to the Air India bombings at this time. I'm talking around 2005, 6, 7. But the more I looked to academic literature, really, it was quite apparent to me that there was a huge gap. And so really, this was how I began. I met Renée not long after that. And in fact, both Isha and Renée's work has been really foundational to me. I've turned to this small but important creative archive on the Air India bombings, and it has really informed and been really impactful with respect to my own research, and really as a means of coming closer to this particular history as someone who was encountering it from a distance. But this creative work has really helped me understand the gravity of this history, the ongoingness of it, the weightiness of it, and really the personal experiences of grief that Renée and others continue to feel.
Shachi, as a former journalist, pollster, you have so many ways of reading into this event. Of course, stories of colleagues of yours that you would have heard in the newsrooms and all of that, but also more recent polling that you've been involved in. So maybe you can share a little bit.
Happy to. So my journey around this is almost in 3 chapters. I didn't lose anyone personally in the bombing, but I knew what it was to be a small child in a community that felt fear, that knew what it was to not feel safe, that knew what it was when your parents were no longer shopping for groceries on the same street that they used to shop in and in the same neighborhood, because that didn't feel like a very safe place to be. To hear your parents whispering on the phone or with their friends at corners about this thing that had happened. But we grew up in a news junkie family, to not see anything on the news about it, or it was 15 seconds or 30 seconds, and that's all there was, and then you moved on. So that was chapter 1, to sort of have that, to be imbued with that early on, to be steeped in that early on. And as I listened to some of Renée's poetry around the experience of children of Air India, I'm not a child of Air India in that sense, but I'm a child of the community in that era. And I also know the weight of dealing with that and processing that at the same time when there is an expectation on assimilation and fitting in and getting on with it, just get on with it. There isn't necessarily an understanding or even a voice or an adjacency of what happened. It was never announced in our school the next day. It was like this thing that happened, but did it really happen? So, chapter 1. Chapter 2 was a journalist. And so going and speaking to the loved ones of victims, speaking to their children, having to drag them out in front of a camera through the trial, at the end of the trial, through the inquiry, Are you up for a clip today? What's your message? What would you like to talk about? And recognizing now in 2023 that a whole generation of those who grieved are either gone or at the end of their journeys in life, at the end of their lives, towards the end of it, and do not have the energy to keep that flame alive anymore. And the conversations with the children who are now adults and their mixed feelings around it, wanting to carve out lives that are separate from their personal tragedy, wanting to carve out lives from what feels like a stigma because there was no validation of their grief at the time. It's almost a shame. They feel almost a shame around it. And then also wanting to ensure that it's not forgotten. So those are more of the micro experiences, and then there's the macro experience. I transitioned from work in broadcast and political journalism to work in public opinion, data and polling. That took me from the micro to the macro. I always think of it as telling stories, not with personal interviews and clips anymore, but doing it with data and in the aggregate. And it would always bubble up every year, every June, and you would get a sense and sort of ask the question, and colleagues would ask the question. We would also talk to each other. So I wonder how many Canadians actually know about this, that it happened. I wonder how many can even identify this as the worst mass killing of Canadian citizens since the Dominion of Canada came to exist in 1867. And so I did what I could do in my role as a public opinion pollster. We ran a poll about it. We ran a survey. And the data was, I didn't expect it to be fantastic, but it was pretty damn stark. 60% of Canadian adults between the ages of 18 and 34, so we're talking about young Canadian adults, 6 in 10 have never heard of Air India Flight 182. They've never heard of the bombing. 4 in 5, 80% of Canadians cannot correctly identify the events of June 23rd, 1985 as the worst case of terrorism or mass killing against Canadian citizens. They think of and identify the École Polytechnique tragedy. They think of 9/11. Some name what's the legacy of residential schools. They cannot identify this thing that happened. Most don't know that no one was ever convicted of murder. Yes, there was a conviction for manslaughter and a later conviction against the same individual for perjury, but no one was ever convicted for conspiracy or first-degree murder. Those that do know a little something tend to be over the age of 55. They tend to believe that justice was not served. They tend to not have a lot of faith in CSIS or the RCMP, frankly, to prevent such a thing from happening again. But really, when we talk about forgetting, or when we talk about remembering, both of those verbs are active verbs predicated on a knowledge that existed. And what these data showed us is that the knowledge doesn't exist. It's not that memories are being erased. There was never anything written on the page. And that was the finding from June. And as we do with our work and our mission at the Institute, it's just to measure. It's to measure. What do Canadians know? What do they think? What is their opinion? What is their experience? And what we found is it was a great national shrug of the shoulder.
And of course, we're in this moment now of geopolitical implications with Canada and India, with recent events. And in terms of writing my own self into this story as well, I was in elementary school. It was the first time I got called a terrorist by other students going to school. And in small towns like Williams Lake, where I grew up, and other places, to this day, there was splits within communities. So to this day, there's 2 Goodwas in Williams Lake, in a fairly tiny community. And you see the cultural implications of those socio-political divides. And I often say there's no politics like diaspora politics in the way those oral histories have helped shape, fragment, and different fissures. And also, in the sense there were also people in communities who had sympathies around particular political persuasions, but not necessarily terroristic ones. And so in some ways, the way the community was framed in a broad sense as terrorist as well has had huge implications in the BC context, and oftentimes not talked about or written about or thought about or brought into public visibility in a way that might be healing, or to talked about in perhaps a more nuanced way. So there's a lot here that all of you have raised. I think it's only just the beginning of how we pick at this wound in a way that we can kind of create a kind of solidarity or a movement into how we think about this in a different way. And I think when I think about your book of poetry, there's this temporality of an event that happens in a given time. You're writing it in a particular time. 10 more years have passed. And yet, this continues to, we can continue to read into this because events around us, even in the Lower Mainland, continue to be present. So I'm wondering if you could speak a little bit just around the creative process and even the passage of time, how you look at this work, both in terms of how you developed it in the first place and how you kind of now look back on it and what it brings up for you.
Mm-hmm. So many things. I just want to really acknowledge the thoughtfulness of everyone here and what you're saying. I'm like nodding my head and making internal notes and wanting to go deeper. But this idea of silence, and maybe a silence because there's nothing there, or silence because it's too nuanced, too complex, too painful. Silencing of self and cultural memory, what is not there in the archive. These were big preoccupations for me in the creation of this book. There's a whole sequence in the book about the bomb. Someone made a bomb with the intent to kill, make a bomb, and put them on the plane, found out ways to put them on the plane. The bomb detonates, everyone dies. Those are just facts. And how do we then discuss those, like we're doing here today, without becoming what I say, like shouty, the shouting of slogans, which sometimes have their purpose, but how do we open a safe space for voices and stories and difference of opinions? I mean, it would be really interesting to see what difference of opinions might be right here on the stage in talking about these things and how to have those difficult conversations. I want to really acknowledge SFU's Center for Dialogue. I think those are ways, practiced ways, the work that the Angus Reid Institute does, what Angela does, what you do with this Office of Community Engagement. You have a lot of different speakers coming here with a lot of different views. And so one of the things for me over the 10 years in the creation of this book has become just a real passion, which is we can talk about difficult, nuanced, and complex histories without shouting at each other. As we look at the unspeakable heartache of the world around us, especially right now, that sense of creating a safe space that isn't Pollyanna, that isn't rose-tinted glasses, that understands there are very complex justice issues, that violence is both individual and systemic, but that we do not have to shout and be filled with hate. And surely as Canadians, if there's anything that comes out of Air India, I love this beautiful story of the small town with two Gurdwaras, and then the split, and then what happens amongst family and communities where then we just don't talk about it. I feel we need to make some unequivocal stances as a community that I'm going to disagree with you, and it's okay to disagree, but as Voltaire said, I'm going to defend to the death your right to disagree with me, because that's the essence of democracy. And that's how I want to live. I don't want to live in a world where if you and I disagree, tomorrow I'm going to be in my home, and you're going to think, well, I can come take you out. Is that who we want to be? Like, I don't think so. And I think even some of the people who might romanticize violence and protest, I don't really think they think so either. So that is a profound part of how I wrote the story. Just a little example. At the time of writing it, I was very conscious of the amount of systemic racism that, of course, since Black Lives Matter, we're re-examining, that exists in any society, particularly ours. We have our truth and reconciliation process, which is so profound. We have BIPOC and transgender issues, just as an example. And the systemic discrimination against men of color, you were called a terrorist, particularly men who happen to wear turbans. I was very conscious that I did not want my work to plug into that. I wanted to create a book that honored the dead, didn't talk about the perpetrators, didn't glorify or romanticize them, and I'll have more to say about that later. I think the conversation as a creative has become very important to me. But I also didn't want to give a free pass to the people who, under the guise and cover and masquerade of sympathy, are really saying racist things. And just as an aside, I love your question about over the span of the years. I actually have an internal file of some really weird comments that people have deposited on me over the years about race and class under the guise of offering sympathy. Oh, I'm so sorry about what happened. So there's sort of the usual, there's a kind of, very lovely and authentic and sincere empathic comments. And then within a few moments, kind of strange racist comments, often about sick men, deposited on me as if, oh, I'm going to agree with them. And usually I just avoid, because I'm such an avoider, I hate conflict so much. So then my silence, probably they walk away thinking that I'm agreeing with them, and I have to find ways to not agree with them. But I'm collecting all these comments. Maybe one day I'll do a version of Claudia Rankin's Citizen, my own version of that. But that's just an example that it gets really complex. And so how are we going to actually have these conversations? And how are we going to deal with violence? Isn't that the big shibboleth in the room often? One person's terrorist is another person's freedom fighter. What is the end result of that? If we choose to espouse violence, what happens after? And that is my continuing work creatively. But I'm pontificating now, so I should stop.
And I'm going to also ask you sort of this question of temporality in terms of your own research when you look at public memorials, the working through of memory or big events in terms of community. If you could speak a little bit to how you think through time or what your research has shown.
Yeah, that's really interesting. I mean, because I think I was 12 years old in 1985, I don't have a memory of the bombings, and as I described, it was as a graduate student that I really began to learn about them. So my work in many ways, my research starts around that period, and I've been thinking about my research on public memory as being about the cultural afterlife of the Air India bombings. So I actually don't spend a lot of time talking about the histories of violence that the bombings kind of emerge out of, or describing those conflicts. I'm really, interested in the ways in which memory of the bombings or forgetting of the bombings has shifted over the years in terms of public discourse. I talk a lot in my work about frames of remembrance, the ways in which memories are framed, whose memories circulate, how these memories circulate, and what the manifestation of these memories are, and whether they cause change. I'm interested in thinking about, memorialization is often imagined as a kind of conclusion or maybe even reconciliation or a form of closure. But in fact, I think practices of remembrance, there's often a resistance to those projects because people think that they're kind of backwards looking, and they're like, well, we need to be in the present, we need to look to the future. But in fact, I think the project of remembrance is about how we make sense of the past in the present through the lens of the present with our investments in the present moment. And so I think that, you know, the practice of remembrance has the capacity to actually be transformative, in that it's not just about learning a set of facts about, you know, what happened, or about those who came before. It is really about making a relationship to knowledge, making a relationship to history, and in particular to those whose lives are immediately affected by the Air India bombings in this instance. And I think it is very present and future focused in that sense, in that I think it is critical that we find ways of remembering losses, because the losses don't belong to the past, they belong to the present, and they are ongoing. So I'm interested in the ways in which the Air India bombings have been talked about differently, you know, over time. I'm interested in the timing of things like government responses, in particular the belatedness of those responses. I'm interested in public discourses around, after 9/11, war on terror discourses really began to shape the way the story of the Air India bombings were told in hindsight. And I think more recently, discourses of reconciliation are, and kind of like, you know, hopes for a rehabilitated Canada are shaping some of the ways in which the Air India bombings are talked about. Yeah, so anyway, there's a lot there that has to do with timing and the ways in which time really does get fractured also by trauma. And, you know, the Air India bombings are sort of not a linear narrative in many ways. And I think when we can look to Renée's creative work in particular, we see that sort of shift in time, but like returns of certain kinds of questions and dynamics that the Air India bombings have raised. And just finally, I want to say about the Angus Reid poll something that I think is really interesting in terms of time. There is now an archive of Air India records, of government forms of remembrance. There is a small, burgeoning body of scholarship now. There are a number of creative contributions on the history of the Air India bombings. But there is a way in which memory of the bombings has not seemed to puncture, you know, collective consciousness. It is unsticky. It doesn't stick. It gets kind of forgotten quite quickly. Maybe I can just recall one more thing. It was a really interesting interview that happened, I think, in 2020 during the early months of the pandemic. And the interview was with Sushil Gupta and Deepak Khandelwal with CBC News. They were talking about how their plans around the anniversary of the bombings changed because they had intended to be at public memorials on the anniversary, but these events were being canceled because of COVID. And there was a lot going on in that moment as well. The Ukrainian International Airlines flight had gone down. Black Lives Matter and Justice for Black Lives were, there was a lot of momentum around that. And as they were talking about, the plans that they had with their own families and closer communities, Deepak Khandelwal actually also noticed that no Canadian national newspaper made mention of the Air India bombings on June 23rd. So the interviewer asked, was that just a symptom of all of these other things happening, all of these things going on at once? Or, she asked, do you think that race had something to do with this? And he spoke very eloquently about the ways in which the Air India bombings continue to be forgotten because they are a history that is about the loss of brown lives. And we know in the Canadian context that some lives matter more than others, some lives are made more grievable than others, some lives are made more memorable than others in their loss, and those are white lives. And so this moment in the interview where Kandalwal, was describing how it is that the Air India bombings managed to fall out of the news cycle on the very anniversary, I think it was the 35th anniversary, I think was really telling and speaks to this kind of oscillation between remembrance and forgetting and the way in which the bombings, still happened and have not happened. It's the way in which Renée puts it in her poetry.
I was going to bring in Shachi for a second, just around the question of time, which your poem reads into, that the memory is not there. But as a pollster, how do you think about how the continuity of memory gets disrupted or broken back, or what is it about the culture that this is where we're at?
So again, I would just gently underline the fact that this isn't even about loss of memory. It's about absence of knowledge. It's about absence of awareness. But your question or your point still holds up around, I think a lot about narrative. Who owns narrative? Why do they push narrative? What is the benefit in pushing narrative? And when we look at both the small and the big P politics of a lot of things, Canadians are capable, people are capable of galvanizing around a moment or a person or a tragedy or an injustice at a moment in time. Technology has something to do with it. The age of the cell phone camera has something to do with it. But also, Angela, you talked about some lives are more grievable than others. I agree. It isn't always only white lives. It can be lives that are deemed innocent or apolitical or not then part of a larger conversation that nobody wants to confront or have. So we talked about tensions within diaspora. What's happened? Let's just remember for a moment that through the 1990s, the Prime Minister of this country stubbornly refused to call a public inquiry into the stonewalling and the bungling of an investigation for big and small p political reasons, because it affected votes, it affected diaspora votes. I mean, that is a fact. And when we saw the validation through the inquiries under the Harper era and in a post 9/11 environment, I think, yes, that spoke to a new awareness or a new consciousness of the impacts of capital T terrorism. But at the same time, there was a political undercurrent running through it as well. So when I think about this tragedy, and when I think about the lives lost, I think about how it has also become part of a tug of war or a ping pong game in terms of the small and big P political narratives that have surrounded it, which makes it a more complicated thing to grieve. It shouldn't be. They were innocent people who bought tickets to get on a plane to go visit a country, either in the names of seeing their relatives or going and traveling and tourism. These are not people who had an agenda. But the agendas upon agendas that have been piled on to the history and the storytelling of this issue have served to mute or erase the innocence of the victims. And that's something that has struck me through time. We don't actually have in provincial curricula, as far as I know, any set standards or syllabus around teaching this. The fact that you, as an extremely educated person, Angela, did not hear about it until a very advanced part of your own formal education is, to me, somewhat bone-chilling. But we don't teach it at schools, as far as I know. I think it's largely up to teachers to decide what they want to teach. Why can't we have those conversations, particularly against the backdrop of people not knowing? So in all of that, I also think that there was, just if you do facts and you do history, it was almost the perfect storm of erasure, of this story being at risk of erasure. It wasn't just one person on a plane in a family that died with a whole bunch of other relatives then to surround them and hold vigils and hold their pictures up and advocate for them. In many cases, it was entire families or 3/4 of a family wiped out, with then a widow or a widower being called back to their home country to build a new life. The uncles and the aunts and the cousins and the nieces and the nephews, in many cases, were in a whole other country when it happened. We think about the day that we memorialize victims of terrorism in this country, June 23rd. It's the day before the Fête Nationale in Quebec, the day before Saint Jean-Baptiste. It comes at the end of Pride Month. This year it ended up competing, and I use air quotes, or in competition. I don't mean it in that way, but I mean, news directors have to make decisions. With the 100th anniversary of, I think, the head tax. I could be wrong on that, but there was like another immigrant story in there. So think about the energy that it takes if you are the loved one of a victim to just get up and out of bed every day, right? The weight of loss, the weight of grief, the weight of carrying on. And then we have put onto their already weighted down shoulders the burden and the weight of activism. Just in like, hi, I exist, please remember me, please remember what happened. And so, you know, it is almost a perfect storm of components that guarantee the erasure of this.
I was going to bring up Svetlana Matvienko, who teaches in the communications faculty here. She went to go visit her parents in the Ukraine when the invasion happened, so she happened to be there. She's come back and given a couple of talks, and she's raised this question of, you know, the Canadian cultural context of being distant and far away from events that sometimes is a blind spot in Canadian culture. Chris Oliveras, who started Drawn Quarterly bookstore in Montreal, has just recently done a book on sort of the prehistory of the FLQ, which, you know, oftentimes things that are talked about in the history curriculum are about October 1970 rather than all of the events that happened before. I'm wondering, Renée, I guess to all of you, there is an aspect of Canadian culture that leaves us perhaps a distance from conflict zones or other forms of political culture where people who have arrived from those places are very much used to talking about this or having it in the curriculum, or it's part of the living memory of people that if in a country here where only recently the state is, you know, recognizing colonial history, let alone all of the other blind spots that might be there, you could maybe speak to that a little bit. And I'll add a question to you, which is around what is it about poetry that allowed you to get into this story that other forms of writing or cultural work? What is the sort of potential in poetry?
Well, maybe I'll start with that. For me, it became the only way to tell a story that couldn't be told. So what my colleagues have quite eloquently and thoughtfully talked about, that energy of memorial and how to memorialize and capture if you're both grieving and a creator. And I think with poetry, it allows you to enter time in different ways, enter the immediacy of lives lost through language, through sound. I've had the great privilege of collaborating with, for instance, Turning Point Ensemble for the opera we did with John Oliver, who's here. I hope after the event, when we're just having a conversation, you might chat with him. We have a set of musical collaborations we did to memorialize what we've been talking about, the lives lost and the incidents. So I think somehow memory, metaphor, language, the sense-based narrative that poetry affords gives us a way to link our emotions, our heart, our soul, to facts and to trauma. So for me, poetry was the only way I could tell the story. And I sometimes say that I'm my most eloquent when I'm in my poetry creation. Everything I say now just feels like a fairly crude, sometimes, approximation of the nuance, the complexity that I want to explore. So there's a whole section in this book, Children of Air India, about a town that I never heard about growing up, Paldi, which is now being much more recognized. It's a very interesting settlement of immigrant citizen settlers on Vancouver Island in the Cowichan Valley, just a few miles outside of Duncan. And what was remarkable about it was that there were Japanese, First Nations, South Asians, mainly Punjabi, but not exclusively, and working white-class people like Swedes and so on, who weren't actually allowed to own land in Duncan, and formed this amazing multicultural workers' community of Paldi. It was a sawmill, pulp mill, and thinking about our climate emergency, just some of the nuances of that, and it's a whole other discussion, is quite fascinating. But the reason it becomes so important in my book to pick up on both the absence of knowledge and then the way we memorialize it was that when I went into the archive of the Air India bombings, I realized that the bombs were actually made, tested, and detonated in the woods outside Duncan. And I kept seeing this phrase, in the woods outside Duncan. I thought, what is that? The woods outside Duncan? I had no idea. So I literally, my husband took me on the ferry, and it's a poem in the book and then a whole series. And I went and did site research of pretty much exactly where this whole bomb was made, bought, created, tested, through the archival great controversy between the erased thesis tapes and the RCMP files, figuring out when the woods outside Duncan. If you just Google Justice Nature's inquiry report, you will see whole sections on this. And I made the connection, wait a second, this is a community, the Sikh Punjabi community has been there forever, really amazing working class families that were very diverse, inclusive, through labor. And it was Paldi. The woods outside Duncan is Paldi. And when I went and interviewed, for instance, an amazing settler pioneer woman, Joan Cameron Mayo, a Scottish citizen settler who married Punjabi Sikh businessman, and they formed this incredible company, a pulp and sawpaper company. She talked about how outraged her Punjabi in-laws were that the bomb makers chose this area to do their business. What a defilement it was. And so I tried to put that whole complexity of saga into the poetry. And one of the unauthorized interjections I put into the poem in the book was a friend's comment to me when I was sharing exactly this story. And she said, I didn't realize, really, when I think about Punjabs, I just think like they're either victims or they're terrorists or something. She's a really good person. I really care for her. But she said that to me. And so I just put it in the poem. So I sometimes think that poetry, like other forms of creative writing, allows us those unauthorized interjections. You can put into writing and into creative works a type of nuanced memorialization that a stone plaque or a speech doesn't necessarily do. What was the second part of your question, or the first part of your question?
Just around, I guess, Canadian political culture or education, like what is it about the blind spots that we have here? You know, I've got friends from the Balkans. We talk about conflict all the time. I lived in Haifa for a year, working with an NGO, so I was talking about conflict and all sorts of forms of political violence all the time. There seems to be a kind of embargo or a way to maybe talking about it in a limited way that allows for that erasure or that blind spot or that amnesia to perpetuate itself.
Yeah, well maybe it's, to do my own racial profiling. I'm the daughter of a late United Church minister. Maybe it's our bedrock Presbyterian, don't talk about the war, don't have music at your church services. Like, we're a fairly restrained society. I rather like that. But maybe this sweeping under the rug is a quintessential Canadian drive, consensus. And consensus so often is a kind of whitewashing of these difficult conversations. I think some of the blind spots are connected to local politics, at least here in BC. I think, what I would say to Angela is I think some of that racism is actually a kind of cultural tribal thing that happens within the brown on brown communities for the very reasons that Shachi has been relating, that people are nervous about other people typifying them, putting labels on them. I certainly am too. I mean, I already said I didn't want to be deemed racist against my own people. I wanted to be in solidarity with other brown people, particularly the working people of this province, when I wrote this book, so that I had to find a way to frame or situate my grief and my creative impulse within trying to do that. I don't know. That gives.
Yeah, to both of you, like this question of Canadian political culture or education systems, the media environment.
Yeah, well, as an educator, I'm really interested in the question of why there is so little knowledge about the Eritrea bombings, what we can learn from their commemoration and memorialization, or different expressions of them, including creative works like Renée's. There's a concept in educational theory called difficult knowledge, and difficult knowledge doesn't refer necessarily to like horrific, violent facts, but it refers to the ways in which some knowledge really comes up against some of the dominant narratives that we have of Canada, the ways in which we are used to thinking about and learning about Canada, the relationships that exist here. And I think the Air India bombings, in a lot of ways, are difficult knowledge in the Canadian context, because they were a bombing that originated on Canadian soil. The perpetrators were Canadians. The victims, or those who were killed in the bombings, 331 altogether, 280 of whom were Canadians. That history of violence, that event of violence, very much discordant with the image and story, the narrative of Canada as a peaceable place. The good Canada, where there is multicultural coherence and cohesion, very much challenges that narrative. And I think, when we think about the founding of Canada in ways, the ways in which it really was founded upon a genocidal erasure of Indigenous peoples, the land was taken from Indigenous peoples. I mean, that is our history. So in many ways, I think we are versed in a kind of covering over of violence here. I think it's right under the surface a lot of the times, and I think it does shape these these conversations that we're having. And, you know, it kind of brings to mind, I might want to talk about the Stanley Park Memorial to Air India. That's where Renée and I met, actually.
Yeah, we actually met at the Stanley Park Memorial around the time of the inquiry, I think.
So the memorial was established in 2007 in Stanley Park, and you know, I've been reading about Stanley Park and how it was established, and you know, it's on the unceded territory of Coast Salish communities, and you know, that were Coast Salish peoples were forced off the territory so that a military reserve could be established on that, I don't know if it's called peninsula? Yes. And then eventually Vancouver leased the land from the British to establish a park, or a public park. So there was this forcing of certain peoples out of that space, Indigenous peoples out of that space, to make it a park. And then, you know, through the coordination of the federal government, the provincial government, and the city of Vancouver, a public memorial project was established, and Stanley Park became the site of it. So for me, there's quite an interesting question around, you know, what it means to commemorate a history of violence in a place, in an occupied place, in a place that has been its own kind of history of violence. So there are many layers there of forgetting and disavowal. And these are so brilliantly conveyed actually through Renée's poetry that I sometimes will describe as a work of palimpsestic memory, like the palimpsest, the layers of kind of seeing through. And maybe in particular, maybe I can redirect a question to Renée, but what I think about a lot are the ways in which, if people have been to that memorial site in Stanley Park, there is a wall with the names of the dead etched into it, naming a very important practice in commemoration of bringing into presence that which is absent and those who are absent or lost. There was a struggle around getting the names to actually even appear on that memorial. So my understanding is that there was an amount of resistance from the Vancouver Parks Board to actually naming the dead on that site. There was a kind of a sense of like, well, we don't want it to look too much like a graveyard. You know, this is a park, this is a public park. People come here for leisure. And I think that that's really, really telling, given the importance of naming. And there was obviously a fear or a reservation of the kinds of questions that might have arisen when people encounter this memorial and see who died. And so I'm so interested in your poetry, Renée, for the ways in which you've redacted names. But, you know, you've done such an amazing job of naming the loss, naming the grief, naming the violence, all through your work.
I don't know if this is the right time. I didn't want to necessarily interject if you had another question. Yeah, okay. I just so am grateful for Angela. Well, first of all, for the incredible research and scholarship that includes my poetry. I did write a poem before this book was born called Air India / Stanley Park, where I put into poetry some of these voices. There was a real racial undertone to some of the comments. So, you know, you always got to be careful around writers, right? Because we just absorb everything and then it goes into our work. But one of the racial overtone sets of comments we got as family members, when we had to organize and be activists to get a memorial in BC,
And this was before the Komagato Maru Memorial, which is a very beautiful and necessary memorial as well. But I can remember people saying to me, different municipal people, like very kindly and very sort of innocently. So when I put the words that I'm about to share with you in the poem, like I don't like to blame and shame. What good comes with that? But I also want to witness and include. So they would say things like, well, we don't want a bunch of Pakis coming and, you know, with all their incense and their food in the park. People say the most fascinating things to me. They say things to me, I think sometimes because I perform whiteness quite well as a brown person. And I told you before, I get really weird comments deposited. And I feel kind of sorry for them because, you know, I'm scribbling them down in my mind. Everything will be used later. But yeah, no, I heard this from people that they were very concerned that an Air India memorial, they barely knew what we were talking about. They just heard the India part. What would happen to Stanley Park? Like, would they be bringing their food and their practices? And I remember, like, just not saying too much. And so people can then just project their own imaginings of whatever it is. So I wrote a whole poem about that, and it's pleasantly published in a beautiful anthology by Mother Tongue Press, another independent literary BC press that's since folded, but Mona Fertig's press. And it's, for those of you who might be educators, it's 77 women poets of BC, edited by Susan Musgrave, and they accepted my 5-page poem, which Angela invited me to present when we went to Paris. So these are the ways in which I think one of the things I just wanted to throw out there is through my relationships with all of you, really, we can keep memorializing in holistic, caring ways. We can witness the lives of the dead by building allyships and community. I just think that's a really important method to do it.
Yeah, I'm going to come back to Shachi, and I think after that I'm going to get Renée to read a few poems, and we'll go out to you for questions and conversation. I think we're going to bypass the video in the interest of time. But Shachi, I wanted to give you an opportunity to respond just in terms of the nature of Canadian culture, the media sphere, academic, of how, when you do your polling, why are we getting the results that we are?
I think we've, at this stage, touched on it, so I'll keep my comments fairly brief. I think it's, we've now canvassed quite well the otherization of the tragedy and the victims. We've canvassed the lack of education and what you call the difficult knowledge aspect of it. And I look to my own former industry as a former journalist and somebody who sees herself currently as what I call journalism adjacent, not in it, but next to it, in also trying to measure and better understand where Canadian society is at. And I think about the complicity of my forebears in newsrooms who knew nothing. All they heard was India, in Air India, who knew nothing of the victims, who knew nothing about the community, who literally, you know, when a bomb and a plane explodes overseas over the ocean, there's also no ground zero to grieve. There's nowhere that becomes a focal point for a television camera and a 6 o'clock, it's the 80s, so everybody watched the 6 o'clock news. There was no focal point. There was no place to go put up photos and put up, you know, trinkets and write names. We didn't, the tragedy itself did not lend itself to ease of visual storytelling. So my predecessors in newsrooms had to get educated fairly quickly. Some of them just absolute heroes, like Kim Boland, who's still at the Vancouver Sun, Terry Glavin of Post Media, Terry Molesky, who was later really vilified for the strength and the passion of his reportage on this subject, to the point where it's almost become, I think somebody's phoning me, so if that's picking up on my phone, I apologize. There's almost like a quiet whispering within newsrooms now. It's like, we have to be careful how we tell the story. So that was the legacy of our predecessors. There was the legacy of my generation that sort of told again the stories of the bungled investigations and the trials and the inquiries, but I think also struggled with trying to be respectful of using the victims' families as props, but also in trying to respect their space and also bring the humanity to the tragedy. And I remember my father always talking about how the tragedy itself, how the bombing itself, how the incident had become an appendage to all these other things, to internecine bureaucratic turf wars, to the big and small key politics of it between politicians, between the conflicts within diaspora. Oh, and over here you've got these victims, and we're going to trot them out from time to time at vigils, and trot them out from time to times for clips, and they're exhausted, but they're still going to do it because they still believe that it might help, it might mean something. And then I look at newsrooms today, and the state of journalism in Canada today. Newsrooms are gutted. There's nobody there. And those who are there are having to be coaxed back into working in newsrooms. In many cases, news organizations have sold off their newsrooms because they don't have the money to keep the news going. So journalists are working from home. And they are also predominantly of that generation of 18 to 34-year-olds, 60% of who have never heard of the tragedy. So when we think about the arc of journalism and the arc of narrative in this, again, it's in 3 chapters, and at the moment it doesn't feel like it's ending particularly well.
Thank you all so much for sharing. And Renée, it would be wonderful to hear a few more poems before we go to the audience for questions. Also, thank you to everyone who's watching on the live webcast as well.
2 poems to end the poetry part. Unauthorized interjection. In the woods outside Duncan, on the island named Vancouver, Swedish, Cornish, Punjabi, Chinese, First Nations, Irish, Scottish, black men work. Show us the mines, the mills, sharp the screeching lathe, sister to a cutting machine on the green chain, men feed in timber, cedar, Douglas fir, the lifeblood of the province, going inside a century's worth of work, mill, mine, marine electrician's shop, where the bomb was made. Oh, my fellow workers, oh, beloved village of Poldy. On an island in the woods outside the town of Duncan, boy, now man, his turban a sign of holiness, stops time. How many years? Cannot count them. How many miles? Speak not of anything but love. What was the sound? Traffic. A moan roar of logging trucks on Highway 18. What are the coordinates? In the woods, off the highway, across from the turnoff, Hillcrest Road. Describe any attributes. Saw no riprap. Name the names of the trees. Cannot name the trees. What was the sound? Pine needles faded to danced brown, falling, falling. What was the sound again? A highway moans. Detritus. Flayed open mattress, metal cast-offs, the backside of a digital recorder. What was the sound? It was the years. It was being there. And the final poem. Time and its dimensions. Gray-green Atlantic. 82 suspensions adrift on the ocean floor, transparent as jellyfish. These children of Air India, their long phosphorus arms sway, sending messages undecipherable. This afternoon, together, a site of research. Somewhere on a tarmac by the ocean, an airplane waits. It is always waiting, but we are not on it. We are not the children of Air India Flight 182. This is not June 1985. These words are not underwater. The only oxygen present is now.